Good afternoon and welcome. My name is Gloria Grabois. I am the director of the G.K. Chesterton Institute for Faith and Culture at Seton Hall University. On behalf of our institute, I would like to welcome you to today's conference, our first online gathering for 2021. We, as the rest of the world, continue to adjust and embrace this virtual format to bring programs to the wide Chesterton community around the world. Today's conference is on Dickens and Chesterton, a sesquicentennial conversation, which celebrates these two remarkable English writers and the latest issue of our journal, the Chesterton Review, devoted to Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens brought out the best in G.K. Chesterton, so it is fitting that he should also bring out the best in the G.K. Chesterton Institute for Faith and Culture and the Chesterton Review. When Chesterton described Dickens, he seemed to be describing himself. He said, Dickens stands first as a defined monument of what happens when a great literary genius has a literary taste akin to that of the community. For this kinship, he was deep and spiritual. Dickens was not like our ordinary demagogues and journalists. Dickens did not write what the people wanted. He wanted what the people wanted. His power, then, lay in the fact that he expressed with energy and brilliancy quite uncommon the things close to the common mind. It is with this thought in mind that we start today's conference. And first, we will welcome our speakers of today. Dr. John Drew is Professor of English Literature at the University of Buckingham in the UK, where he has taught since 1998. He is the editor with Michael Slater of Volume 4 of the Dent Uniform Editions of Dickens Journalism, published in the year 2000, and author of Dickens the Journalist in 2003. He publishes and reviews widely on Victorian print culture and the works of Dickens. Since 2012, he has directed the open access web archive of Dickens journalism. Dr. Dermot Quinn. He is professor of history at Seton Hall University, very well known in the Chestertonian community, and a member of the board of advisors of the Chesterton Institute, and is the newly appointed editor of the Chesterton Review. He was educated at Trinity College, Dublin, and New College in Oxford, where he was awarded a doctorate in 1986. He has written extensively on Chestertonian themes. He has authored 3 books, as well as many articles and reviews in the field of British and Irish history and Chestertonian themes. At the end of this program, we will have a short Q&A session. Please submit your questions through the chat option. However, due to time constraints, we may not be able to answer all of them. But as always, you are welcome to write to us to chestertoninstitute@shu.edu, and we will get back to you with the answers. We thank you for joining us today, and we also are very happy to see that Father Ian Boyd, founder of the G.K. Chesterton Institute and founding editor of the Chesterton Review, has joined us today from Edmonton. So we also welcome and we celebrate Father Boyd's being part of our gathering. So we also would like to welcome all of our friends from all over the world, from Canada, Poland, Spain, Mexico. We see Danuta Norris from the Center for Catholic Studies as well, and all of you for being part of this community. And without any further ado, let's welcome Dr. Drew and Dr. Quinn for today's program. Thank you.
Hello. Good afternoon, everybody. It's such a huge pleasure to be among you, and I hope that you're hearing me loud and clear. And I'm going to show you quite a lot of illustrations to go along with my talk. But before I share my screen, I just want to say a quick word about the false background that appears behind me. This is a painting of Charles Dickens's study, at which he was working in 1870, when he died sort of in the middle of writing a book, as I'll be talking about a bit later in my talk. So this is his Gad's Hill study. A student of mine has been working on a new online project to catalogue all of the books that you can see on the bookshelves behind me. And that resource I hope to be able to share with Chesterton followers as well in the next few weeks. So I'm going to pass now to my presentation slide. Always a slightly awkward gap while we endeavor to get it up on the screen. But hopefully we're now seeing a title that says The Journalism of Charles Dickens, Special Correspondent for Posterity. And perhaps Dermot, if you're there and your microphone is off, I can't see anybody now, but if you can just give me the nod and tell me that I'm showing my screen.
Yep, certainly are.
Terrific. So I'm going to be coming on a bit later to explain that title, Special Correspondent for Posterity, but I'm going to be talking about Dickens's journalism. And, you know, the fact that we're living through such hard times at this point in the second decade of the 21st century, that provides, I hope, an excuse for this paper's focus on the journalistic career of an artist of Dickens's stature. For me, there's little doubt that the press, whether we think of it in print or digital format, and the practice and profession of journalism is under threat at the moment in ways that simply didn't obtain 50 or 100 years ago. And today, I think a great journalist, a reporter whose words reverberate in the corridors of power, is as much to be valued by our culture as a great novelist, and perhaps will also run greater risks in uttering those words. So yes, the Special Correspondent for Posterity is the subtitle of my paper. But before I explain its origin in more detail, I just want to remind us all briefly of that great cavalcade of novels, 15 of them in total, that gave Charles Dickens, during his own lifetime, such international renown. And we would begin with the first really successful one, which was Pickwick Papers, and I will run through them like a familiar scale of notes. And indeed, there's the cover of the first. I often find when I'm talking in public in a hall, and I go through this list, that hardly have I said the first part of the title, then you get a kind of response from the audience. The audience will be able to complete the rest. So, you know, do this at home if you like. So the Pickwick Papers, then comes Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, The Old Curiosity Shop, Barnaby, it's a bit harder this one, Barnaby Rudge, and Martin Chuzzlewit. And I'm going to take a bit of a pause there, because in standard accounts of Dickens's development as an artist, these normally form a group. His early carefree comic phase. It's the novels are very picaresque. Theme and plot are perhaps not so much in his mind as scene drawing and dialogue. But even these novels, when they've been revisited in the 20th century by critics, a huge amount of artistry has been found within them, and themes running through. We then move into a middle phase with Dombey and Son, the uncannily autobiographical David Copperfield, Hard Times, Bleak House. We're getting my ducks out of order. Bleak House, and then Hard Times. And by this point, Dickens has kind of shed the early comic skin of his youth when he published under the pseudonym of Boz. And he's really now writing in the middle of the 1850s into what was called the condition of England question. And he's very much a critic of the way that England, Britain and its empire is developing, and for Dickens, the imperial sparkle of the Crystal Palace is somewhat dimmed by the fog of Chancery and the smoke of Coketown. But there's a lot more to come as we move into the late 1850s with Little Dorrit, and then the novel that's most popular, I think, in the United States, A Tale of Two Cities. Often a personal favorite of readers, Great Expectations, and then the final completed novel, 1864 to 1865, Our Mutual Friend. And we come then to the novel that Dickens was writing when he passed away in June 1870. That's, as it were, the background to my screen at the moment. His Gad's Hill study, and he was he died in the middle of writing The Mystery of Edwin Drood. Only half of it ever published, and it has spawned a whole series of attempts to complete it that a colleague of mine in the department at Buckingham has written about, a whole book about, our endless attempts to finish Charles Dickens's unfinished novel. So that's the if you like, the major fiction, but I'm sure many among you will think, well, there are some really powerful and well-known stories of Dickens that haven't even been mentioned yet. The most obvious would be A Christmas Carol, but it was only one of 5 different Christmas books that were published during what were called the Hungry Forties in Great Britain. This is the time of the Irish famine, remember, and following A Christmas Carol, the year after came The Chimes, and The Cricket on the Hearth, The Battle of Life, and The Haunted Man. I think successively those Christmas books become less and less well known, but it's very well worth picking up a complete edition and reading through. But like the restless spirits of his Christmas books, Dickens was always on the move, and he actually published as well some travel books, including American Notes, based on his initial visit to what he called the Republic of My Imagination, his visit in 1842, and then a delightful series of sketches of life in Italy that he called Pictures from Italy. So that's a great cavalcade of writings. It's not yet complete, though, because his very first book, which I'm going to spin in like a newspaper, was called Sketches by Boz. And obviously my dog likes that title. You can hear him barking away, perhaps in the background. And this is then coming to the fact that Dickens began his writing career, and for me never really left the profession in the profession of journalism, because Sketches by Boz is a collection of newspaper and magazine work that was then collected into an anthology and published in book form. And if Michael's able just to spotlight the camera for a little bit, this collection of newspaper sketches has actually, paradoxically, just come out in a massive 900-page edition, which I'm waving at my webcam at the moment, a massive 900-page edition, superlatively edited by a Dickensian colleague in Aberdeen, and that's now available for the first time as a scholarly text. So wonderful! All of this work from the pen of a young journalist, very fresh-faced, but at the same time surprisingly mature in his experience of the startling variety and exuberance of metropolitan life. And talking of Dickens's face, I want to leave his works to show you some familiar images of the author. And it's worth pointing out that the portrait of the author that perhaps is best known, which would be perhaps this one, if any of you were using British banknotes in the 1980s and 1990s. That image, I think, is gradually being surpassed by a picture of a much younger Dickens. But this is the Victorian patriarch, isn't it? A thoughtful, somewhat careworn, if not worn out older man. And there's a rather savage description of him in a novel by a 20th century novelist I'm fond of called Elizabeth Bowen in the first part of her novel, Eva Trout, published in the 1960s. She described the older Dickens as the confused, pouched, violent, raddled-looking face in its hirsute bedding artistically distraught. She was no fan, I think. But the image of Dickens that's being promoted vigorously by the Charles Dickens Museum in London at the moment, and one that's relevant to my talk about Dickens the journalist, is a much younger man. Now, for many years, the only painting we had of Dickens as a young man is this very small picture of him aged about 18. But within the last 2 years, a fabulous new portrait of Dickens has turned up by an extraordinary means. I'll show you the picture first. And this is owned now by the Charles Dickens Museum in London. But this is a small oil painting by Margaret Gillies, and it was lost for the best part of 170 years. It turned up in 2018 in a tray of bric-a-brac out for sale in a South African market. And somebody, presumably somebody with eagle eyes themselves, thought actually that's quite interesting, and they did a little bit of cleansing and did a little bit of research, and then got in touch with the London antiquarian dealers who ascertained that this was a missing portrait of Dickens from the early 1840s, when he was approaching the age of 30. Elizabeth Barrett Browning said of this period that Dickens had the dust, I'm quoting, the dust and mud of humanity about him, notwithstanding those eagle eyes. So there we are. This is the face of the reporter, and so to my subtitle, special correspondent for posterity. This phrase comes from a review of Dickens's work by a Victorian critic called Walter Bagehot, who founded The Economist, and who was reviewing Dickens's works in 1858. And I'm going to read the quotation here from the review. He writes, "Nevertheless, it may be said that Mr. Dickens's genius is very well suited to the delineation of city life. London is like a newspaper. Everything is there and everything is disconnected. There's every kind of person in some houses, but there's no more connection between the houses than between the neighbours in the lists of births, marriages and deaths. And as we change from the broad leader to the squalid police report, we turn a corner and we are in a changed world. This is advantageous to Mr. Dickens's genius." I think that's an extraordinarily perceptive insight into Dickens. London is like a newspaper, he's saying. If you look at the layout of a newspaper or the layout of a city, they might actually look quite similar. So that's London. That's the Times, and you can kind of see this grid pattern. And I think this would be also true of many American cities. And Walter Bagehot is saying of Dickens that it's almost like, you know, you've dropped down into the columns of a newspaper, Street View, and you get that random collection and miscellany of things that you would find in a newspaper, and Dickens is doing it by going from street to street, observing what he sees. Now, that's a wonderful insight from the mid-1850s, but Walter Bagehot, when he wrote that, had really no idea of Dickens's background in journalism, because it wasn't part of his public image. But in the 1830s, from the late 1820s, Dickens was working extraordinarily hard to get into the world of journalism. And the way that he did that was by learning shorthand. And I'll be very interested to see, if we get to the Q&A at the end of this session, whether any of you in the audience have learned shorthand, because some of the things that critics are beginning to say about Dickens and shorthand may apply to you. But the system that Dickens used was not called Pitman's, which didn't come in till the late 1830s. In the late 1820s, the best shorthand system in town was called brachygraphy, rather unappealing name, developed over various generations by the Gurney family. And Dickens religiously set down to learn all the different squiggles, including the famous arbitrary characters. And in David Copperfield, where David Copperfield is having to learn shorthand in that novel, Dickens recalls quite how difficult it was to master these arbitrary signs. But what is now being argued is that he spent so long, 7 years, immersing himself into this system and then customizing it to the point where his own shorthand notes cannot actually be deciphered by modern students of shorthand, that this process of adaptation actually changed the way his brain works and is responsible for some of the inimitable language games that he plays as a stylist. And that's the argument of a recent and very excellent book called Dickens and the Stenographic Mind. So he's learning this system and being sent during the 1830s on a lot of errands as an apprentice in journalism. And we can see here, for example, one of the courts called Doctors' Commons, when the building now destroyed, where Dickens plied his trade as a freelancer. And this was an odd jumble of business that was heard in Doctors' Commons, ranging from ecclesiastical business and trials to shipping accidents and so forth, and he would take shorthand notes. But he got to be so good that he was quite quickly called into the House of Commons, where he looked down on the politicians of different parties, I suppose metaphorically as well as physically, because he felt that they didn't necessarily behave themselves in particularly attractive ways. Nevertheless, he was very good at capturing their language. He was working for the Mirror of Parliament, the True Sun, and particularly for a radical paper called the Morning Chronicle. All of that was threatened in 1834 when, you may perhaps be aware, there was a terrible fire and the old Houses of Parliament burned down, captured here by that wonderful painter, J.W.M. Turner. You can almost feel the heat coming off the rafters there. And that's what led to the building of the current Houses of Parliament, familiar from many a picture postcard and visit to London. He was not only employed for newspapers in Parliament, reporting the debates, but he was sent out and about to record in shorthand things that were happening in the country. And I'm going to pause to read you a couple of extracts here from early journalism and visits that he made. Here, for example, is the Castle Yard at Exeter. Excuse the typo, Exeter, in the southwest of England. And Dickens recorded in a speech towards the end of his life his visit to record the election there. He said, I've often transcribed for the printer from my shorthand notes important public speeches in which strict accuracy was required, and a mistake in which would have been to a young man severely compromising, writing on the palm of my hand by the light of a dark lantern in a post-chaise and four, galloping through a wild country, all through the dead of the night, at the then surprising rate of 15 miles an hour. The very last time I was at Exeter, I strolled into the castle yard, there to identify, for the amusement of a friend, the spot on which I once took, as we used to call it, an election speech of my noble friend Lord John Russell, in the midst of a lively fight maintained by all the vagabonds in that division of the county, and under such a pelting rain that I remember two good-natured colleagues who chanced to be at leisure held a pocket handkerchief over my notebook after the manner of a state canopy in an ecclesiastical procession. And you can get something of the enjoyment that Dickens had looking back on his early journalistic career. And here's another extract from an early newspaper piece when he was sent up to Edinburgh to record the speeches at a massive celebration to congratulate the Prime Minister, Lord Grey, on the successful passage of what was called the Great Reform Act, which had reformed parliamentary representation in Britain. So one of those little bodies there, you can imagine, is Dickens's. He's getting ready to record the speeches. But before the party arrived, the main party of dignitaries, something rather terrible had gone wrong with the protocol, and this is how Dickens described it. It had been announced that the dinner would take place at 5 o'clock precisely. But Earl Grey and the other principal visitors, as might have been expected, did not arrive until shortly after 6. Previous to their arrival, some slight confusion and much merriment was excited by the following circumstance. A gentleman who, we presume, had entered with one of the first sections, having sat with exemplary patience for some time in the immediate vicinity of cold fowl, roast beef, lobster, and other tempting delicacies, for the dinner was a cold one, appeared to think that the best thing he could possibly do would be to eat his dinner while there was anything to eat. He accordingly laid about him with right goodwill. The example was contagious, and the clatter of knives and forks became general. And hereupon several gentlemen who were not hungry cried out, "Shame!" and looked very indignant. And several gentlemen who were hungry cried, "Shame!" too, eating, nevertheless, all the while as fast as they possibly could. In this dilemma, one of the stewards mounted on a bench and feelingly represented to the delinquents the enormity of their conduct, imploring them for decency's sake to defer the process of mastication until the arrival of Earl Grey. This address was loudly cheered, but totally unheeded, and this is perhaps one of the few instances on record of a dinner having been virtually concluded before it began. So this is just a little moment in life that Dickens captures in the formal cadence of a newspaper report. But what fun he's having with this breach of protocol. And it's exactly the same kind of angle on life that he takes into his early writings, such as Pickwick Papers. And his connections with newspapers continue all through the period when he is writing some of those well-known novels. He edits Bentley's Miscellany. He produces Master Humphrey's Clock and publishes articles and stories within it. He writes leaders for a paper called The Examiner, and he is also the overall editor for a short period, admittedly, of something called The Daily News. And when he stands down from that position, he's still saying to his literary agent, it would be great to found something. And found something he certainly did. He founded a weekly magazine that lasted for the rest of his life, that he edited week in, week out for 20 years, 24,000 words of letterpress edited by Dickens every week for 20 years. And it's so little known. And so my last slides are going to be to illustrate this journal and magazine and Dickens's involvement with it. And there he is in this montage. I've figured him as a conductor because that's how he referred to himself in the columns of this magazine, not as an editor, but a conductor, conducted by Charles Dickens. And the metaphor is polyvalent and means lots of different things. But there are his offices, just north of the Thames, north of Waterloo Bridge. Perhaps we can get a little spotlight on the place on Wellington Street. And if you've ever visited London and you've been to see the Lion King at the Lyceum Theatre, you're exactly in the right place. Diagonally opposite is where Dickens's offices were. And he worked with a whole team of contributors. And this slide is just showing you a few of the faces. You won't be able to, I'm afraid, to read the subtext underneath the pictures. But what a fine crop of moustaches and beards we have here, and a range of very competent, interesting writers of non-fiction, including some who, like Dickens, mastered both fiction and non-fiction, like Wilkie Collins. And here is the front page. His journalistic manifesto is for imagination, and the importance of romance in our understanding of private, of public affairs, and how, you know, the life in a country may be highly industrial, but there is romance in that industry, and that's what he wants to bring out. And I'm just going to nip back to show you how heavily he copy edited. This is absolutely typical of a contributor's page, with Dickens's copy editing showing the attention to detail that he had. One reason why the magazine was so successful, that he sprinkled his own imaginative additions all the way through it. Some contributors didn't like being having their contributions interfered with, and on this slide we can see some of them. There should be an illustration here of Mrs. Gaskell, Elizabeth Gaskell, who got very cross with Dickens for over-editing her work. But let it be said, his contributors more widely, about 30% were women writers, most of whom were not published before. And so although he was no feminist or proto-feminist in his general approach to life, he certainly gave breaks to a lot of women writers who earned very good money from writing for his periodicals, and then were able to republish their work freely without having to buy back their copyrights. I'm just moving into my peroration now because, Dermot, I fear that I'm trespassing on our time scheme, but all of this journalism is now available at this web address. And Michael, if you were able perhaps to put that into the chat, then it's something that colleagues can take away, and those who've attended can log in. The website was launched in 2012, and it's got about 30 million words in it, originally read by a computer, and we found it necessary to go out to the public at large and say, please come and log into our database and help us correct the text. And this is a process sometimes called crowdsourcing, and we crowdsourced the correction so that every word is accurate and searches can be accurate. So when the news got out all over the world, in Spain, in the Netherlands, and in Australia, and lots of contributors as well joined in the States, and within 9 months we'd got those 30 million words corrected and proofread in the database. So that was wonderful. And since then, to keep people interested, we've been re-serializing some of the fiction from these magazines, including A Tale of Two Cities, Great Expectations, and a wonderful novel by Wilkie Collins called No Name. And again, it's possible for anybody in the world to join in, receive a weekly installment, and then contribute to the chat and discussion around it each week. So that's a brief sketch of Dickens's journalistic career. And it was a career that Chesterton, being such a fantastic critic of Dickens, took note of. And so when in 1911 he published a collection of prefaces to works of Dickens, he had much to say about the journalism and non-fiction. He found something extraordinary and replenishing in it. So I'm just going to finish with what Chesterton wrote. About these additional, miscellaneous, and even inferior works of Dickens, there is, moreover, another use and fascination which all Dickensians will understand, which, after a manner, is not for the profane. All who love Dickens will understand that he is really inexhaustible. And it is this fantastic infinity that divides him even from the strongest and healthiest romantic artists of a later day, from Robert Louis Stevenson, for example. I have read Treasure Island 20 times. Nevertheless, I know it. But I do not really feel as if I knew all Pickwick Papers. I've not so much read it 20 times as read in it 1,000,000 times, and it almost seemed as if I always read something new. So we of the true faith look at each other and we understand. Yes, our master was a magician. I believe the books are alive. I believe that leaves still grow in them as leaves grow on the trees. I believe this fairy library flourishes and increases like a fairy forest. But the world is listening to us, and we will put our hand upon our mouth. Thank you very much. I've concluded, and I'd like to pass over to Dermot now and stop sharing my screen.
Okay. Am I visible and audible? I hope I am. If not, then we are in difficulties. But if I'm not audible, someone will gesticulate wildly to the effect that you can't
Loud and clear. I'm hearing you.
Oh, good. That's good. That's great. Okay. Well, first of all, I'm just delighted that you've all come along and that we've all been marvelously entertained by Dr. Drew's talk. I feel a sense, frankly, of anticlimax awaiting you because I do not have a slideshow. Chesterton once said that I was fond of saying that don't believe in anything that can't be said in coloured pictures. Well, we've seen some wonderful coloured pictures from Professor Drew this afternoon, and I'm sorry that I can't actually reciprocate with some coloured pictures of my own. But John has given us such wonderful food for thought. When I met John last year at a conference in Spain when we were talking about Chesterton and Dickens, he told me that in his student days in Oxford, he was an actor, and I think we can get some sense of his actorly abilities. I mean, he provided not simply a marvelous text of his own, but the voices of Chesterton and Walter Bagehot and so on. And in fact, I'm delighted that he quoted Walter Bagehot, editor of The Economist, because Bagehot, in his famous book, The English Constitution, essentially, as I understand the argument of the English Constitution, said that we really must distinguish between appearance and reality. And as we try to grasp the nature of power in England, we have to distinguish between the kind of the ceremonial and the efficient aspects of the Constitution, and in some respects that is Dickens's theme as well. I mean, Dickens is interested in power. He's interested in appearance and in reality. So Bagehot, in a sense, is a kind of an appropriate little motto to think a little about Dickens and indeed about Chesterton. So, having said that. Let me proceed by giving a little talk, which again I apologize is not accompanied by coloured pictures or pictures of any kind. So do your best to create the pictures in your own heads. Well, last year marked the 150th anniversary of Charles Dickens's death. And in 3 years from this year, we will mark the 150th anniversary of Chesterton's birth. So birth and death, roughly 150 years, separated. And I think these two events are connected because Chesterton grew up, as he never failed to insist, in an essentially Dickensian world. Some of his earliest memories were of characters who could have graced the pages of the Pickwick Papers or Nicholas Nickleby, but who occupied instead the streets of Kensington below Chesterton's bedroom. Chesterton's London was as he put it himself, a rich and rollicking city of swivellers and Micawbers, of larger-than-life eccentrics, of hypocrites, Chesterton joked, but at least sincere hypocrites. Chesterton's solid, respectable childhood was a world away from the back alleys of Clerkenwell or Smithfield Market, but it was Dickensian nonetheless, not only in the theatrical types who peopled it, but also in the social range which allowed such theatricality to flourish. His real subject matter, George Orwell wrote of Dickens, is the London commercial bourgeoisie and their hangers-on, lawyers, clerks, tradesmen, innkeepers, small craftsmen and servants. And that was Chesterton's world as well. The British middle class that really was a class and really was in the middle, as Chesterton put it in his autobiography. And by the time he published that autobiography in 1936, the year that he died, that England was gone for good, but it had been rapidly disappearing long before that. Well, Chesterton's debt to Dickens and to the imaginative landscape they shared was repaid in the form of two books, Charles Dickens in 1906 and Criticisms and Appreciations of the Works of Charles Dickens in 1911. Dickens bulks large in Chesterton's masterwork, The Victorian Age in Literature, and is the subject of a critical essay, The Great Gusto, which appeared in a collection called The Great Victorians in 1932. And references to Dickens in Chesterton's other writings are really too numerous to count. What Lawrence Mazzeno has called the Dickens industry owes much to Chesterton, both as a contributor to that industry and as a subject of that industry. T.S. Eliot thought that there was, quote, no better living critic of Dickens than Mr. Chesterton. Peter Ackroyd claims Chesterton as perhaps Dickens's best critic. Michael Slater views Charles Dickens, that's the book by Chesterton, as splendid, and Criticisms and Appreciations as a major landmark in Dickens' studies. Father Ian Carr considers the first of these books, Charles Dickens, as one of the classics of English literary criticism. The Dickens industry and the Chesterton industry overlap. See, for example, the superb issue of the Chesterton Review devoted to Dickens in 1985. And see also the doctoral work of Peter Hunt, which was devoted to Chesterton's Dickens criticism. So together, they offer a rich seam of material for scholars and biographers to excavate and explore. And Chesterton and Dickens are similar in that each deals, these industries, each deal with a protean personality. What we see in Dickens, Chesterton wrote, are not novels or stories, but, quote, simply lengths cut from the flowing and mixed substance called Dickens. A substance of which any given length will be certain to contain a certain proportion of brilliant and bad stuff. And in a way, the same could be said, I think, of Chesterton. Much of what he wrote was superb, and some of it was frankly second rate, and some of it was certainly recycled. But it was all cut from the flowing and mixed substance called Chesterton. So to read Chesterton on Dickens is to read Chesterton on himself. The two are really inseparable. Well, to be sure, this very inseparability is the reason that some people find Chesterton on Dickens a bit hard to take. He can seem too loud, too intrusive, too attention-seeking, as if he is the subject and Dickens merely the pretext. Mr. Chesterton has dressed up his 2 or 3 paradoxes until we are weary of them, wrote one critic of Charles Dickens, the book Charles Dickens. Most of them are familiar to all. A few bluff words about Christmas, a few hale and hearty lines in favour of wine, and when these gags are used up, he can always stand the obvious upon its head and look wise. Considered as a criticism of Dickens' writings, insisted one reviewer of Criticisms and Appreciations, this volume is extremely disappointing. Although read as a series of essays by Mr. Chesterton, it is intensely entertaining. Well, these are, I think, familiar tropes. Chesterton as a comic performer, trundling out old tricks, using Dickens as his straight man, kind of stealing every scene. We could do with less gunpowder and a surer aim, one critic wrote about Chesterton's works on Dickens. And I think that's a kind of a sneering comment, but it's one that was not unfamiliar in the years after those books were published. Well, some of these complaints have merit, not because Chesterton's critical judgments are disappointing. In fact, they're often extremely sharp. Nor because the style is sometimes too clever for its own good, but because Chesterton, by constructing Dickens in his own image, created yet another Dickens character, and that character was Dickens himself. Chesterton's biography is not really a biography at all. It doesn't give us a fully formed human being, but a figure in an argument, a character in a play, only to be brought to life through stage directions. I mean, here, for example, is what Chesterton wrote about Dickens in chapter 1 of his biography, and to me, it reads, as I say, like stage directions. Dickens, quote, "Dickens was always a little too irritable because he was a little too happy. Like the overwrought child in society, he was splendidly sociable, and yet suddenly quarrelsome. In all the practical relations of his life, he was what the child is in the last hours of an evening party, genuinely delighted, genuinely delightful, genuinely affectionate and happy, and yet in some strange way fundamentally exasperated and dangerously close to tears." Well, whatever this is, it's not biography. Other people in the book, Dickens's father, for example, are only prototypes. They are the characters that they are about to become in the novels. Charles Dickens, the book, is not a biography in the modern sense, or even very much in the Edwardian sense. Readers looking for flesh and blood should really look elsewhere. Indeed, I think we can make this point go a little farther. Dickens's genius for naming characters is well known. Wackford Squeers, Mr. Gradgrind, Ebenezer Scrooge, Uriah Heep, they all sound what they are. And it is tempting, or at least it's tempting to me, to think that had Dickens ever created a large, lumbering, top-heavy journalist, a magnate and a magnate, of Fleet Street, he would have called him Gilbert Chesterton, because the name is as fitting as Pecksniff or Bounderby. Charles Dickens was a character invented by Chesterton, the inspired Cockney, the rousing English radical. And Gilbert Chesterton was a character invented by Dickens, the blustery wordsmith in an overstuffed waistcoat. They are both, as it were, literary concoctions by literary men. So, to Chesterton then, Dickens was less a person than an argument. But what was that argument? Well, it is essentially that Dickens represented, both in his work and in his life, he represented for Chesterton certain ideas that he wished to identify with and claim as his own. The first part of the argument was that Dickens was an optimist, a democrat, and the greatest novelist of the 19th century. He represented, Chesterton claimed, a new and overwhelming force in Victorian life, and that force was the English people themselves. His emergence was like, as Chesterton said, the rising of a vast mob. Before Dickens, the radical voice of the common people had been drowned out. Cobbett had spoken for England, but Cobbett was dead. Byron and Shelley were aristocratic anarchists. Wordsworth was a frightened Tory. Hazlitt and Lamb were mere essayists, and Bentham was a calculating rationalist, a bit like the Walter Bagehot that Professor Drew just mentioned. The industrial middle classes and the landed aristocracy came together to exclude the rest of the country. And that was what Chesterton argued. And then along came Dickens, loud and brash and indignant. And here is Chesterton describing the advent of Dickens. He attacked the cold Victorian compromise, and he attacked it without knowing he was doing it. He had no learning. He was not misled by the label on the bottle. He opened his mouth and shut his eyes and saw what the age of reason would give him. And having tasted it, he spat it out. It's dramatic language, I think. Dickens was a Cobbett for the modern age, rejecting atheist, and these are quotes from Chesterton, atheist industrialism and the leisurely oppression of the poor. He expressed in novels, and again this is Chesterton, as crowded, as populous as towns, the voice of the common, tragic, realistic, free-spoken people of England. So Chesterton's notion of what you might call the people's Dickens, paralleling the people's Chesterton, expressed his popularity and his self-conscious identification, both with his subjects and his readers. Dickens did not write what the people wanted, Chesterton liked to say. He wanted what the people wanted. Now, Dickens was complicated, both as a man and as a writer. He was complicated enough to fear the mob in Barnaby Rudge, for example, and to celebrate it in the Pickwick Papers. He knew how tyrannical a democracy could be. Tyrannical that's Chesterton's line. Yet human beings profoundly engaged him. They are as big as you are, whoever you are, said the American writer Joseph Mitchell of the waifs and strays and eccentrics who crowded the streets of New York in the 1940s and 1950s. And that I think could be Dickens's motto also, and Chesterton. Chesterton shared Dickens's reverence for the poor, the socially invisible, the overlooked. His world was of ordinary men and women who, closely examined, turn out not to be ordinary after all. Of course, Dickens dealt in types and caricatures, in people larger than life or cramped and confined by it. But that was only because that was the best way to convey a kind of exuberant humanity that transcended material circumstance. Now, to his critics, of course, this was little more than sentimentality, the notion that horror can be overcome by happy thoughts. Dickens, and this is Chesterton again, Dickens was commonly occupied in satirizing the Gradgrinds, the economists, the men of Samuel Smiles and self-help. And against them, and again this is Chesterton, and against them he was in the habit of pitting the people of a more expansive habit, the happy Swivellers and Micawbers, who, if they were poor, were at least as rich in their last penny as their last penny could make them. Chesterton and Dickens believed in extravagance, in generosity, in panache, in largeness of spirit, in what the great Australian poet Les Murray once called the quality of sprawl. So that's the first part of the argument. Chesterton regarded Dickens as making an argument, and that was the first part of that argument, that he was the voice of the English people. And the second element of the argument is that Dickens's revolt against wretchedness was grounded on hope. Precisely because he had a clear and happy philosophy, precisely because he was astonished by injustice, precisely because cruelty made him angry, Dickens expressed the humanitarianism of the early 19th century, the revolutionary belief in the very possibility of social betterment. This is Chesterton. The optimist is a better reformer than the pessimist. The man who believes life to be excellent is the man who alters it most. The man who believes life to be excellent is the man who alters it most. But not every critic sees Dickens this way, of course. Dickens as a man of hope, Dickens as an optimist. For George Ford, Chesterton missed Dickens's bitterness, his radical grudge against the world. For Julian Simons, no account of Dickens is adequate, Chesterton's included, that fails to acknowledge his, quote, ceaseless exaltation and depression. For Mark Spilka and Frederick Carl, the darkness in Dickens overcomes the light. In fact, Chesterton never denied Dickens's resentments, his pettiness, his occasional mean-spiritedness. Chesterton acknowledged, that certain kinds of optimism can be brutal, evil, and debased. He knew that Dickens was full of anger and ambition, vanity and doubt. Yet, if optimism means a certain embrace of life, an openness to astonishment, a way of seeing the world as a gift and as a grace, then Dickens had that optimism in abundance. Well, linked to optimism was the notion that human beings are more than the sum of their circumstances. Dickens and Chesterton were, I think, strangely ambivalent reformers, both demanding remedies for cruelty while celebrating the irreducible human spirit that could overcome any material difficulty. So that's I think, in a way, the ambivalence of them as reformers. They demanded remedies for cruelty while celebrating the irreducible human spirit that could overcome any material difficulty. Dickens never had a theory of society. He condemned Victorian capitalists while never giving much thought to capitalism itself. He attacks the law. I'm quoting Chesterton again, George Orwell. He attacks the law, parliamentary government, the educational system, and so forth, George Orwell wrote, without ever clearly saying what he would put in their places. It would be difficult to point to anywhere in his books to a passage suggesting that the economic system is wrong as a system. Chesterton thought that this criticism of Orwell was misplaced, claiming that it demanded of Dickens a preference for ideas over people, that Dickens was the first to satirize in others. And here's Chesterton. He saw that there was a secret thing called humanity, to which both extreme socialism and extreme individualism were profoundly and inexpressibly indifferent. He saw that economic systems are not things like the stars, but things like the lampposts, manifestations of the human mind, and things to be judged by the human heart. Chesterton regretted Dickens's indifference to theory, recognizing that it weakened his assault on social injustice, but he believed that his largeness of heart compensated for it. So that's the second way in which Chesterton saw Dickens as making an argument. And the third way, the third element of the argument, in other words, Dickens as a proxy for Chesterton's own ideas, the third element is that he represented a rebuke to the cultural pessimism that pervaded late Victorian and Edwardian England. And this is the subject about which the late Professor John Coates wrote so brilliantly for many years in the pages of the Chesterton Review, the cultural pessimism that pervaded late Victorian and Edwardian England. Chesterton wrote for the Daily News from 1903 until 1913, the paper, as Professor Drew pointed out, that Dickens founded and briefly edited in 1846. And Chesterton used the Daily News as a platform to rail against imperialism, corruption, the party system, financial malfeasance, state-sponsored welfarism, the loss of local identity, the destruction of family life, among many other things. And as he made the case for trusting the people, he recruited Dickens as a kind of comrade in arms. Dickens's themes were Chesterton's themes: individual loneliness and anxiety, romantic populism, affection for the family and the small community, constant recourse to the symbols and occasions of communal festivity, an anti-utilitarian bias, and above all, a firm belief that it was possible to feel, distinguish, and clearly mark out moral good and evil. The difference between them was that Dickens lived in an atmosphere of democratic optimism, a confidence in common men, whereas Chesterton inhabited a fin de siècle world of epistemological collapse, of, as he put it, decadence and pessimists ruling the culture of the age. So by turning Dickens into a spokesman for popular causes, a cheerful and sentimental radical, Chesterton hoped to restore a vigorous tradition of civic engagement, excuse me, in which patriotism was understood to include criticism of one's country and not mere acceptance of it. Chesterton saw Dickens more profoundly as one who wished to free human beings for the enjoyment of freedom itself. As a young man, Chesterton had dabbled in diabolism before recovering his wits and holding on to his sanity, as he said, by one thin thread of thanks. At the back of our brain, he wrote, there was a forgotten blaze or burst of astonishment at our own existence. The object, Chesterton wrote, the object of the artistic or spiritual life was to dig for this submerged sunrise of wonder, so that a man sitting in a chair might suddenly understand that he was actually alive and be happy. Dickens was a man, Chesterton said, who had fallen in love with the universe, and he wanted everyone to do the same. And this is why, to bring these three arguments together, this is why the primary elements in Dickens are not the stories, but the characters who affect the stories. Dickens was less interested in plot than in people, in their capacity for moral agency, in their ability or their inability to achieve mastery over their own lives. Dickens, to Chesterton, was not so much a novelist as an impresario, a collector of caricatures, types, specimens, and grotesques. When he failed artistically, as he sometimes did, it was because his human insight had failed him. When he succeeded, as he did more often, it was because he understood the nature of the people he had created, understood them as if they were autonomous beings, independent of the author himself. Criticisms and appreciations of Charles Dickens is essentially a series of psychological portraits in which even minor characters are given their due. If indeed we can talk of minor characters in Dickens, of people less worthy of respect merely because they play a walk-on part in a story. People are always center stage, even when they are off stage in Dickens. We are aware of them as having lives outside the story in which they participate. Every Dickens character is an old friend, even when he first appears, Chesterton wrote. His best figures are at their best when they have least to do. Dickens's characters are perfect as long as he keeps them out of his stories. That's a pretty good Chesterton joke, I think. Micawber is noble when he is doing nothing, which, as we know, he does most of the time. They are not characters in a novel so much as human beings who happen to be part of one story or of many stories, most of which we will never read. Dickens's characters are thus more interesting as social than as psychological studies. They seem designed to be observed or seen, to have an existence in relation to others, to be part of a community whose solidity is assumed. It misses the point, I think, to criticize them as figures lacking reality or psychological depth. At one level, it was precisely as types or caricatures that they were most real, at least to those who saw them. Here, for instance, is Chesterton on David Copperfield. We know the actual types in the book. We all know the stiff-necked and humorous old-fashioned nurse. We all know the intrusive stepfather. We all know the erect and sardonic spinster. We all know Steerforth. But while these are real characters, they are lit up with the colours of youth and passion. They are real people romantically felt. That is to say, they are real people as real people feel them. They are exaggerated, like all Dickens's figures. But they are not exaggerated as personalities or exaggerated by an artist. They are exaggerated as personalities are exaggerated by their own friends and enemies. We have Murdstone as he would be to a boy who hated him. We have Steerforth as he would be to a boy who adored him. It may be that Murdstone in common life was only a heavy businessman with a human side that David was too sulky to find. It may be that Steerforth was only an inch or two taller than David, and only a shade or two above him in the lower middle classes. But this does not make the book less true. In cataloguing the facts of life, the author must not omit that massive fact illusion. All the characters seem a little larger than they are, for David is looking up at them. Well, I think that's a wonderful piece of criticism. And it's very good because the technique is cinematic, capturing a child's vision by means of sudden close-ups and distorted perspectives. Chesterton's brilliance as a critic and Dickens's brilliance as an artist was to understand that the distorted perspective is often the right perspective. Chesterton thus saw things to admire in Dickens, his passionate humanity, his moral urgency, and he saw things to condemn as well, his thin skin, his bathos, his argumentativeness. What he admired most, I think, was his sense of wonder. Distortions of perspective are heightened forms of insight. Seeing things the wrong way round is often the only way to see them the right way round. And that is the secret of what Chesterton called that eerie realism with which Dickens described London, a point that Professor Drew just made. I mean, here is Chesterton again. There are details in the Dickens description, a window or a railing or the keyhole of a door, which he endows with demoniac life. The things seem more actual than things really are. Indeed, that degree of realism does not exist in reality. It is the unbearable realism of a dream. The most fantastic thing of all is often the precise fact. And I think the same principle was at work in his description of people, in which exaggerations, distortions, and grotesques do not point us away from the truth, but towards it. Dickens, Chesterton insisted, told us to use our imaginations in order to understand the world as it really is, and people as they really are. So here he is. I will end with this quotation from Chesterton on Dickens. Every day we neglect tootses and swivellers, guppies and joblings, simmeries and flashers. Every day we are missing a monster whom we might easily love, and an imbecile whom we should certainly admire. This is the real gospel of Dickens, the inexhaustible opportunities offered by the liberty and variety of men. I think that's a wonderfully Chestertonian insight, the inexhaustible opportunities offered by the liberty and variety of men. It is the utterly unknown people who can grow in all directions like an exuberant tree. It is in our interior lives that we find that people are too much themselves. It is in our private life that we find people intolerably individual, that we find them swelling into the enormous contours and taking on the colours of caricatures. Many of us live, this is Chesterton, many of us live publicly with featureless public puppets, images of the small public abstractions. It is when we pass our private gate and open our secret door that we step into the land of the giants. If this is the gospel of Dickens, it is also the gospel of Chesterton, who saw in Dickens what he hoped to see in England, liberty and variety on the march. As a child, Chesterton noticed characters from Dickens beneath his bedroom window. As a man, he might even have become one of those characters himself. But man or boy, he wanted us to see, as if for the first time, those unknown people who pass us by every day of the week. They are as big as you are, whoever you are. So I thank you so much for your kind attention. And I once again thank Professor Drew for his wonderful coloured pictures and, of course, the magnificent commentary that went along with them. So I think Gloria is now in charge of our proceedings. And
yes, well, thank you very much to John Drew and Dr. Quinn for the excellent presentations. And for our Q&A, we have received a few questions from our guests. So I will direct the couple for Dr. Drew, a couple for Dr. Quinn, and there's a couple of them that will be for both of you. So we start with a question that we have received for Dr. Drew. The question is, do you prefer Dickens's nonfiction or his fiction?
So I hope you can hear me, Gloria, and
I do.
And thank you very much to the questioner. And it's an easy and it's a difficult question at the same time. I can say personally that I prefer the nonfiction, but that is a limited perspective born out of my recent sort of not exactly professional career, but it's that, and it's also I think that there was a period of my life when I adored novels, and I feel as though I've passed through that now. And the essay, the short think piece, is what grabs my attention. And Dickens excels in this format. It's one of the reasons why I'm such a so passionate in espousing the values of his nonfiction and his journalism. But we've heard from Dermot really a very splendid deconstruction of the boundary between fiction and non-fiction. And I would say that Dickens's people, the characters that provide wonder and provoke him to some of his best writing, he writes about those characters equally in either genre. And it's also worth noting, I mean, I showed you all of those book covers for the 15 novels, plus sketches by Boz, and then the travel writing and the Christmas books. Only one of those publications ever hit its audience as a book first, and that was American Notes. Everything else began life in little bite-sized pieces through the process of serialization. And that is that adds a dimension to Dickens's work that is missing from the way he was read in the 20th century, and it's really hard to recuperate. But that dimension of time and feeling that you are coming across Dickens in your life and his observations on your journey through a century, that produced this extraordinary synchronicity and this extraordinary bond between readers. And that applied both to his serial novels and to his magazine editing. And I think that the idea that Dermot put forward of him as an impresario is where we should leave this question. You know, he's bigger than either non-fiction or fiction. He straddles and hybridifies those genres.
Thank you. The second question for you is, does Dickens deserve his position as the most prominent writer of the 19th century?
I mean, again, the simple answer is no. Because I exist not only to teach Dickens, but also there is a fabulous canon, and a canon of writers that has been growing and has been contested, and is redefining itself always. And there are so many 19th century voices that are worthy of our attention. I remember during the period of the Dickens bicentenary in 2012, when there were so many celebrations on both sides of the Atlantic, really worldwide, for that anniversary. Some really quite bitter voices in the press, highly regarded professors like John Sutherland, saying, "Enough already! Enough, Dickens, please." What are the other authors whose bicentenaries came and went with virtually no murmur? Elizabeth Gaskell. There hasn't been a great splash for George Eliot's bicentenary, and so many talented writers. I think one of the things that has assisted Dickens is that he's more adaptable than any other writer of the 19th century. In other words, he moves into cinema, early cinema particularly, and then dominates broadcast time. And he's even moved into video games, comic books, and has become, if you like, just he and his characters a meme in the 21st century. No other 19th century writer has achieved that. But to dissect what makes Dickens so adaptable would probably be, a major course in a university level for 16 weeks or something like that.
Thank you. Following up on that question, I have a question for Dr. Quinn. What does Dickens' popularity say about popular taste? We cannot hear you.
Am I audible?
You're audible.
Okay, good. Audible and visible, immortal, invisible, God only wise. That's a very interesting question, and in a way, I think I certainly agree with what John has said, that a distinction has to be made between Dickens's prominence as a 19th century writer and his greatness. And I don't think we're in any doubt about his greatness. But as John rightly says, there's a very, very robust canon, and Dickens is part of it. But what does Dickens's popularity say about popular taste? Well, that is, I would say a couple of things. First of all, it says something good about popular taste. I think it says something very good about popular taste. As has often been said, great writing creates the taste by which it is understood. And I think in a way that is certainly true of Dickens, who is a great writer and has created the taste by which he is understood. So as John says, he has achieved a sort of meta status as someone who has, so to speak, captured the popular imagination in a way that, frankly, I don't think George Eliot has captured the popular imagination. I mean, we all know Ebenezer Scrooge, we all know Uriah Heep, we all know Sarah Gamp, and so on. We all know David Copperfield. So that popularity says something about, I think, his greatness as a writer. But popularity is a sort of an evanescent and dangerous thing. I mean, for example, I was thinking about this morning, and there was a poll. I just kind of looked this up. John may well remember it, but I think in 2002 there was the BBC conducted a sort of opinion poll as to who were the top 100 Britons of all time, not simply of 2002. Who were the top 100? And Dickens came in number 41. which strikes me as pretty low. I mean, John may disagree, but I thought he would do a bit better than that. And I thought he would do a bit better when I looked at some of the people who beat him. And I just kind of I kind of I noticed some of the people who in this poll in 2002 were deemed to be greater than Dickens. So Dickens was 41, and he was beaten out by, at number 17, a man called Michael Crawford, who starred in a program in Britain called It Ain't, Some Mothers Do Avum. I think he was also in, was it Joseph and the Amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat or something like that. Dickens was beaten
Phantom of the Opera.
That's what it was, John. Thank you. Dickens was beaten in this opinion poll of the greatest Britons by Paul McCartney. He was beaten by David Bowie. He was beaten by David Beckham. And he was beaten by Eric Morecambe. John knows who Eric Morecambe is, but I suspect that very few of our American audience would know that Eric Morecambe was a very popular comedian in Britain in the last generation. And I don't think by any stretch of the imagination could you say that Eric Morecambe is a greater Briton than than Charles Dickens. So what is my point? My point is that I would make a distinction between celebrity and popularity. And between popularity and greatness. Some of these people are simply celebrities, and I suspect if that same poll were taken today, then Michael Crawford would not be number 17. He mightn't appear at all. So they are celebrities, and that, I suppose my point is that says something slightly debased about popular taste. It says something good about popular taste, that Dickens is popular. But popularity itself is something which has to be questioned as perhaps debased or corrupted or lacking in genuine insight. But I think the point is that Dickens, the Dickens industry, which isn't simply an academic industry, but it's just an enormous cultural sort of juggernaut. The Dickens industry has made people aware of I think the kind of imaginative greatness of this man. I stick to my kind of little metaphor or theme that he's an impresario. He brings together a remarkable collection of not types, but of people. I mean, we recognize, Murdstone as a person. We recognize, Scrooge as a person, exaggerated and distorted and grotesque, but nonetheless a person. And that, I think, indicates that people have kind of understood that Dickens has understood them. Dickens understands their life. Dickens understands the kind of people that they encounter every day of the week. And I think that says something pretty good about popular taste.
Thank you. We have one more question for you. What was Chesterton's major criticism of Dickens, and what was his major appreciation?
Well, yeah, that's another good question. And at the risk of kind of repeating what I said in my little talk, I think probably, Dickens, I beg your pardon, Chesterton had a number of specific criticisms of Dickens. I mean, the criticisms and appreciations just is a series of basically introductions to each novel, and some of them he finds fault with, and some, for example, he doesn't think that Micawber should go off to Australia. I think that's kind of silly. So he has some specific criticisms, but I think his kind of major criticism, and I'm open to correction on this, but I see that Dickens, that Chesterton doesn't entirely absolve Dickens from the charge of sentimentality. I think that he finds that there are times when the sentimentality just gets ahead of him. At one point he said that we We shouldn't be moved by the death of Little Nell, but the life of Little Nell. I mean, things like that. So I think he finds occasionally that Dickens's sentimentality gets the better of him. But his major appreciation of him, I think I come back to my point, is that he sees the dignity of human beings. He sees the inherent, invincible, ineradicable dignity of human beings. So he would never like to use the phrase ordinary people, but he recovers ordinariness and sees that it is fundamentally extraordinary. And I think that is to Chesterton Dickens's great genius.
Thank you very much. I have a question that is for both of you. What are the major similarities and differences between Dickens and Chesterton as writers and as people?
I think I'll let John go and try that one first.
Well, I think I'm just going to jump in and talk about the combined careers in straddling all areas of public commentary. I mean, it was certainly an eye-opener for me, Dermot, to at the conference that where we met in Madrid last year, to see how much regular weekly, monthly journalism Chesterton was doing, and that struck such a chord. And it's only gradually beginning to be recuperated. And that's one reason why I was so impressed by the endeavor to translate volume by volume, perhaps a 30-volume series of Chesterton's leaders for the Daily News and other papers into Spanish, so that the Hispanic-speaking world can understand what Chesterton was about. I'm pleased to report that on a much smaller scale, I'm involved in a translation of some of Dickens's journalism into Spanish, which again I hope will begin to change the perception of him as a writer, which I think has been rather narrowed by certain critics. Chesterton not included, but I do include Orwell here, who have not understood his full range. Now, it was partly that the journalism wasn't available anymore. It had been lost in the mist of time. Nobody had volumes of Household Words or All the Year Round, these weekly magazines that he edited, to consult. But it really does change one's perception of what can sometimes seem a rather narrow range. Orwell says he's only really interested in this bandwidth within the aspiring up and down lives of the lower middle classes. But actually, if you read the journals and the articles that he's commissioning, correcting, and publishing by a range of other writers, he's interested in everything. It's really encyclopedic. And I mean, I noted, you quoting Chesterton on Dickens saying he had no learning. A project I'm currently involved with is an online catalogue of Dickens's lifetime library. And it's a pretty big library and it's pretty impressive when we can see how he made use of it in his novels, but also journalism and those fabulous letters, 20,000 letters that are now republished by Oxford University Press. So I say the range, the multifariousness, the sense of wonder isn't everywhere, but the sprawl is. So I think I'll hand over to you at that point, Dermot.
Yeah, well, I think I like that, John, and I certainly agree with you. I mean, there are similarities and there are differences. I mean, the most obvious similarity is that they were both the greatest, enormously impressive journalists and enormously productive journalists. I think, they were both, getting back to your point about range. I mean, Chesterton had an enormous range, and it was the range of a kind of, in a way, an autodidact. If Dickens was autodidactic, then so in a way was Chesterton. I mean, Chesterton, it was just a prodigious reader of a lot of things, and I suspect that some of his Dickens criticism was done, so to speak, from memory. I'm not sure that he actually had the book in front of him as he was writing these little essays. Similarities as writers. Well, here's one similarity, and that is that they both seem to be inimitable, and yet at the same time much imitated. Chesterton, has a very distinctive style. I mean, nobody writes really like Chesterton today. I mean, he is so obviously, a writer of his time. And I can't think, although I'm open to criticism or correction, I can't think of any journalist who writes in the style of Chesterton today. But he's much imitated. A lot of people, sort of like the paradoxes. They like the sort of standing of truth on its head so that you can see it the right way around, and so on. So they certainly are very distinctive in their styles, and kind of in a sense distinctively of their day and not of our day. There are some kind of obvious differences, of course, just in terms of personality and in terms of attitudes. I mean, I don't want to explore Dickens's private life, but it was, let's say, colorful. There were aspects of it that perhaps aren't entirely attractive, and I mean, some of Dickens's views wouldn't have been Chesterton's views. I mean, Chesterton, as we know, was a Catholic or converted to the to Catholicism. Dickens was not, greatly enamored of Catholicism. So they certainly disagreed about things, and I think they were kind of different personalities in a pretty substantial way. I mean, I sometimes think, and I mean, John, you can correct me if I'm wrong here, but for Dickens, I mean, almost everything was literary, in the sense that you look at his children, and you look at the names that he gave his children, and I mean, it's almost as if he is, treating his own children as literary characters. I mean, Henry Fielding Dickens, Alfred Dorsey Tennyson Dickens, and so on and so forth.
Walter Savage Landor Dickens.
Exactly. And I mean, that strikes me. And listen, I don't want to sort of go off on a tangent about this, but that strikes me as kind of slightly disreputable, as if he's treating his own children as stand-up, jokes, But that's just by the by. So I think they have clear similarities as writers. But some pretty obvious differences in terms of their points of view and of their personalities.
Thank you very much. And our last question, a brief question before we are approaching the end of the program, is why was Christmas so important to Dickens?
Well, I'm going to jump in here, Dermot, if
Sure.
if that's all right. And I mean, I think we all know the image and the power of the image of the outcast child running through Dickens's works early and late. And there won't be time, I think, to go into one of the most spectacular manifestations of that, which is when Dickens remembers in his fragment of autobiography what it was like to be on the wrong side of a glass coffee room door, on his own, with no adults to look after him, his parents being in prison. And he just remembered the tremble that went through his soul when in afterlife he saw Moory Fock, which is coffee room seen backwards through the glass. And Chesterton goes off on the whole notion of Moory Fock and regards it as something quintessential about Dickens. But I want to relate this to Christmas because of those Christmas festivities from which he was debarred. the sight of happy families when he was excluded from that. And I don't want to make too much of the Blacking Warehouse episode in Dickens's teen years, but it certainly set a tone that then coincided with a massive cultural thing that's going on in Britain in the 1840s, where an idea of Christmas is popularized by the young royal family, Albert and Victoria, and Albert brings German Christmas customs that Dickens finds extremely congenial. It's actually initially one of the least original parts of Dickens, because he borrows from, as it were, the Windsor Christmas, and then he borrows from Washington Irving, and the sketches of Washington Irving called Bracebridge Hall that were published in the 1820s that Dickens knew inside out. There are even some plagiaristic bits in Pickwick Papers where he's virtually just doing a Washington Irving and changing it to a Cockney scene. But I think when you put all those ingredients together, and the serialization element, so that he's accompanying Victorian families going through a series of Christmases, and he's helping crystallize the importance of family and those reunions. I think we can understand, given what we've all been through worldwide about festivities and not being able to see family, and the importance, the idea of that hearth and home grouping. He'd really touched a chord. So that's my part of the answer.
Thank you very much. Thank you both. And as we come to the end of today's gathering, we would like to thank Michael Supius and Bert Loxley for their wonderful technical support that made today's program possible. We would also like to thank Dr. Drew for accepting our invitation to participate in today's program. And we thank all of you, near and far, for joining us today when we gathered to speak about these two great authors, Dickens and Chesterton. If you would like to continue to read about them, please consider subscribing to the Chesterton Review and or acquiring the Charles Dickens special issue, where you will be able to read today's presentations as well as other articles and pieces about it. Our gratitude to Father Boyd for joining us today and for continuing to be part of our work. In the next few days, the recording for today's program will be posted to our website, www.shu.edu/Chesterton. Please keep in touch. We hope that you will be able to join us for our upcoming programs, which we will announce very soon. Best wishes, and until the next time. Thank you.